Video. Welcome to the North Texas Rotary E-Club. This is, let me see what day it is. It's June 18th. Wow, it's getting far along. Since no one's here but me, I'm going to skip our usual affirmation and our pledge. And I'm going to go right to our speaker, Bob, who's kind enough to be here. And since I'm the only one here, I think it's really cool that she's willing to do a presentation. And we've had some fun talking before the meeting. And for those of you watching the video, enjoy it. Bob, I'm going to mute my microphone because I have a dog and he might bark and I don't want it to over. And then after you're done, I'll come back and we can talk again. So it's up. It's all yours. The floor is yours.
Okay, give me a second here. I gotta share my screen with you. Share. And so tell me, you see working with the next generation? Awesome. All right. So thank you very much for having me today and for the invitation, Howard. I really appreciate it. I love to have an opportunity to talk about this topic. It's a new topic for me, and it's something that I find a lot of business owners that I work with are now talking about with the kind of the transition from the millennials into the next generation. I wanted to find out more about it. I started studying it and started getting some information and realized there is a lot of information about generations that we don't really talk about. So I just want to give you a little more rounded understanding of what the incoming workforce might expect from life and why they think that way. So that's what we'll be looking at today. Let's see if I can get this too. There we go. Okay, so I was going to ask you if you had any questions, but unless you have some questions, Howard. So this is what I was going to ask. With the insight and the things that you might know about the generations that we have today, so the younger generations, what have you heard about them? Or what do you fear? Or, what are your expectations of this generation? And I don't know if you have any, Howard, so I'll just leave it, open it to you.
Okay. I've experienced it's a very selfish generation. It's a me generation. There's a lot of entitlement in this generation. I did the work, I should be rewarded. And it doesn't work like that in the real world, unfortunately. You could be very talented and work very hard and fail. They don't understand that. I'm finding there's a lot of, and I was training the Green Berets about 6 months ago, and they told me the same problem. They're so involved with texting, they almost have no human contact. They don't know how to deal, they can deal with people through the, oh, there's Rick. He's one of our attendees. Hi, Rick. We started, but you're welcome to come. Always welcome. Linda and David are flying home right now. That's why we don't see them. They contacted me.
Sorry I'm a little late.
That's fine. I'm glad you're here. I felt sorry for the speaker. I was the only one here. She just started because it was just me, and I didn't want to hold her up. She was kind enough to offer it just with me. I didn't want to be rude. I thought it would be, and she has a good topic. So I was telling her, she asked me about the generation. So I'm finding they have very bad people skills. They're so used to communicating through text and email that, and I heard this from many people, that when it comes to face-to-face communication, they're lost. They don't really know how to interact with people except through social media. And that's a very big difference from our generation. I'm finding a lot of selfishness. They don't care about what happens to everyone else. It's only about what happens to them. I see a lot of that in America right now, in the politics even. You see it a lot. It's about me and screw everyone else, which is one of the things I like about Rotary. Rotary isn't like that. It's one of the few organizations where people come together and what can I do to help, which is what drew me.
It's interesting that you say that, Howard, because that is some of the things that are very typical about how we think of the generations and what the expectations for them are. So Rick, let me give you a little backspace of it for a minute, just so that you can participate if you want to at this point as well. I'm talking about, the differences in the generations. I just want to give you some understanding of what that might look like for the generations coming into the workforce. and what the differences are. And I'm going to actually tap into all the generations leading up to that. So I got to lay a pretty big background or foundation for this. But I started with, what have you heard about the generations? What do you fear about them, or what are your expectations about the newer generations that are entering the workforce? Do you have any insight into that at all, Rick?
I'm actually retired, so I haven't been working for about a year, but I guess the thing is that they have a different perspective and are still learning about company loyalty and things like that.
Right.
Where there is any.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, you guys have hit on a lot of the Generation Me, the entitlement, tech savvy is some of the other ones. So these are some of the things that I'm actually going to touch on today when we get to that generation. So thanks for participating. Okay, so I'm going to, I want to take a look at some of the trends that are changing. I'm going to focus in on one, but I'm just going to give you a little bit of idea of all the different kinds of trends that are happening right now. And there are many more than what I'm touching on right now, but these trends are, they're not small trends. So we got continuous technology innovation. Now, as a Gen X person, technology changes are very specifically what my entire life has been about. But the acceleration of how that innovation is happening, like in 2 years, we're going to see things that we didn't even know were possible. I was at an HR tech summit today, and the technology that they were talking about using AI to be able to support engagement with employees was like blowing me away. And it's just new. I mean, they couldn't even describe where they were going to go with that. So we don't even know what the technology changes and innovations are going to be in the future, but it's happening faster and faster and faster. There's the trend of the Internet of Things. If you've heard this term, it refers to the technologies that are tied to our lives, like wearable technologies that send information about our heart rates and what we eat and how we engage, and whether we're sedentary or if our sometimes our refrigerators are connected, so they're keeping track of when you have to buy new lettuce and stuff like that. So the Internet of Things is like our entire lives are becoming connected to the internet. There's ubiquitous globalization, so a lot around diversity and inclusionism is big with the trainings for companies and how they're going to bring in people with all the diversity that's going on and the different ways that we talk to and about people. There's data democratization, and meaning that the data that's being collected from us on the internet, we know it's being collected, we don't even know how it's being used, and it's just being shared openly. And it's interesting to have this understanding that there's so much data out there that that it's available to anyone, and what does that actually mean for our privacy moving forward. And if you're a younger person, you may see this differently than a baby boomer would, for sure. Because I can tell you, my father was so afraid of the internet, he actually turned off his internet and put away his computer because he just was afraid that someone was going to come in and take away something that he owned, because he just didn't understand how that his privacy worked on the internet. And that's understandable for the older generation. And there's trends around the control of the narrative, and we see this more and more often in how news is controlling the perspective of their listeners, and that perspective is becoming narrower and narrower, and countries like China controls the entire internet narrative. So that's becoming more of a trend moving forward. But the trend that I wanted to talk about was really about this change of the generations is actually accelerating. So our generations used to be about 20 years in a generation, and it was interesting because that's what I thought that my generation was about 20 years in a generation, but I found it was a little bit different, and that's what I'm going to talk about. Okay, so let's take a look back at some of the generations. The pre-parent generations working our way up to the generations of today. So the pre-parents, the lucky ones they were born between 1925 and 1944. They were born and lived through World War One, the Great Depression, the Second World War, and some of the things that they really truly understood was they understood scarcity and loss better than most generations. They understood that they had to work hard, that they had to sacrifice to be able to get what they needed, and that they could do without. So their mindset around what they had and what they were working for was very different than a lot of the generations that had to come. They were during the pinnacle of industrialization. They had a very heavy domestic farming workforce, and I know in Canada, as in America, that there aren't a lot of people that are willing to work the farms that come from local families. That a lot of times we are bringing in people from other countries that are willing to do the work. They're taking their money back to their own countries, and they're part of our communities for a short period of time for the growing season, and then they go back home. So, but during the Lucky Ones generation, the farming was mostly local workforce. There were quite a few other things that were very specific to them. And one of the things that happened that started changing society was kind of this idea that there was the women could have a vote, and divorce was the rules around divorce had changed. So, as society became a little more open and started to look at all the people in the society, this generation was kind of bringing that and seeing that happening. When we look at the baby boomers who were born between 1945 and 1964, another 20-year cohort, we see that they were born and lived through Second World War, during the rebuilding of our economies after the Second World War, and the introduction of consumption, which was a marketing campaign put on by the governments to help re-stimulate the economies, which became a very core part of how we as North Americans generate income and the GDP internally, because we are always looking at how we can purchase. And it's part of our society and how we see each other by what we own and what we purchase and how we show up in the world. The baby boomers, they grew up knowing that if you got a good education, you got a good job, and that job would last you for life and you could retire with a pension. So they had a very different perspective than the people that are growing up today. They worked hard, they worked their way up the ladder, they would get into management. And some of the things that started changing during the years, at the beginning of that generation, it really was men were the masters of the home, and women would stay home and look after and raise the kids. But by the time we get to the end of the 1964 era and beyond, they were the ones who brought in the music and sexual revolution. They were the pot and war protests and demonstrations for freedom. Feminism with birth control came in with this generation. And then as they moved into management and started taking over management, what we saw with the baby boomers is that they became the institution that they were fighting against a lot of times in the mid to late 60s. So this generation knows a lot about working hard, but their expectation is that you're going to have a job and you're going to probably have that for life. So when they're bringing up their children, which tend to be the Gen Xers and the millennials, which we'll see in a minute, they're talking about, get a good education, get a good job, and that's not what people have an expectation of nowadays. And we'll definitely talk about that in more detail in a second. So I just wanted to give you some understanding about the numbers that I'm using for the years of the generations. Depending on what I've read and what research and what expert and what statistics and what government, the generations could fall into different numbers. I've seen the Gen X start as early as 1964 and up to starting at 1966 and ending as early as 1978 and as late as 1989. So depending on who you talk to, it could be a fairly large generation, and usually they're looking at about 20 years. So if they said 64, it would probably go up to 83 or in that area. For my talk, I'm going to be talking about 1965 to 1979, and I'll tell you why I'm only choosing a 15-year cohort in a minute. But the Gen Xers, which I come from the first year of Gen X, they were the first generation that grew up with accelerated and expected change. So in this generation, the generation knew that everything that they were learning was going to change, but the change was slow. It wasn't like the breakneck change that we have right now, where we have no idea what it might look like in a year or 2 years from now. That's the money that we invest in equipment that we have. We can only expect it to last a couple of years if it's high tech, or maybe if we're looking at a refrigerator or those kind of appliances, maybe they're only built to last 7 years. Where when your mother or your grandmother bought a washing machine, the expectation was that it would last 20 years or longer. And if it did, it was built well, and that's what you expected from someone who was selling that kind of equipment. So with Gen Xers, we didn't have that same kind of insight or expectation of the things that came to us. We knew that things were going to change. Technology was replacing the industrial machines. We were understanding of the deception of media was something that came very clear to the Gen Xers. So by this, what I mean is because media was something that we had to just show up for, and when it was on, so if it was television or radio, you showed up like the baby boomers did when it was available, and you turned the channel. When I was young, and then when I got a little bit older, you pushed the button and there was a wire that was connected to the television. You might remember that. And so you had to show up when they were giving you content. And then if you didn't want to watch what they were giving you, you either watched what they were giving you or you turned it off. There were no other options. So what happened the one time, and you guys might remember this, Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom. Do you remember that? I loved that show when I was growing up. I loved learning about all the different animals and the different places and stuff like that. And then they found out that the idea of the lemmings, you remember that show, which had set, I mean, we have all kinds of ways of saying that the people are like lemmings and they just follow you off a cliff type thing. But then we found out they'd actually push the lemmings off the cliff to create that show. And we learned right then that misinformation and stories could actually be made up and given to us as reality. And because the Gen Xers were keenly aware of this with marketing, and because of this kind of mistrust that had been given to us through from a show that we trusted beyond what expectations would be today, the Gen Xers started that idea of a strong skepticism for what they heard online. So they didn't have the same belief systems. And I believe it was the start of the decline of the organized religion authority over our communities and our lives. So the skepticism and the disbelief of the stories were starting with the Gen Xers, and because the Gen Xers are the parents of the millennials and specifically the iGens, we see that happening more and more. So let me move on here. So this is these are the years that I'm going to use. So the Gen X is 65 to 79. The Gen Ys, millennials, are 80 to 84, another 15-year cohort based on some of the things that I've been researching and the reasons why I want to put them together. And then the Gen Zs, which you've probably heard of before, which we'll call iGens, and I'll tell you why in a minute, is from 95 to 2008, which is only a 14-year cohort. And then the Alphas are being born today. So the iGens are the ones that are just coming into the internet, or coming into the workforce, I should say. And if you look down at the bottom, the iGen was first coined by Jean M. Twenge in her book Generation Me, which is that's how you describe the millennials, the Generation Me, and that was published in 2006. And a lot of the research that I've done recently is from her latest book called, I'll give you the full name of it in a minute, because I don't have it in front of me, but it is about iGens, which is the internet generation. So I just want to go back for a minute if I can. one of the things that I learned about the generations, or one of the reasons why I took it down to a 15-year, is because when I was first looking at these generations, what I found was that the Gen X's at the beginning of the Gen X cohort and the end of the Gen X cohort, I thought there was a mild difference between the two of them, not significant enough for me to go, oh, these aren't the same people, and they really aren't the same generation, but I see something that's very different about how they interact, how they see the world, what they're doing, and that's pretty typical of a lot of generations, but this seemed to be even bigger than what I had seen in other generations before that. With the iGens, when someone had suggested that the iGens were from like a 20-year cohort, and I started looking at 89 up to 2014 potentially, I thought, oh, that just doesn't seem like the right numbers. Like when I started looking at them, they didn't seem to be, and they weren't called iGen when I was looking for them. They were called Gen Z. No one had coined a name for them yet. And I kept looking and thinking, this is too big of a cohort. The people at the beginning are definitely not like the ones that were coming out at the end. And then when I read Jean's book, I started realizing what the differences were. And my numbers are slightly different than hers, but for some of the same reasons. So let's take a look. The millennials, which were from 1980 to 94 when they were born, some of the things that they were seeing were that, the VCRs came out and the VHSs, and they had the opportunity to actually tune into something when they wanted to, watch it when they wanted to, turn it off when they wanted to, and they had access to all kinds of things that they didn't have to wait for. I can tell you, when I was a kid, I looked forward to seeing The Wizard of Oz when it came out once a year, and you had to be there when it came on, and you had to be there for the whole time because there was no way of actually seeing it any other way. But the millennials could go through and consume their content in a very different way. They had different access. They had digital cameras came out. The internet started becoming something that was available to them later on in their childhoods. But they weren't growing up with the internet, not the way the new generation is. So what I found was that they weren't really the stereotype. Like the stereotype fit, but for different reasons than we think. So the stereotype of them being lazy and entitled was, when we look at it from the outside, what we're seeing is people that are they're entitled because their expectation is that if they want something, they should be able to get it on their terms. And it's because that's how we raised them. That's what we brought to them. That's what has changed for them. And what the actual findings around their work ethics and who they are is that they're very hardworking, they're independent, and they're actually more likely to start their own business because they want to work on their own terms. So having them show up in their businesses, so many new tech businesses have been started by millennials and that are doing very well, and they have a different, they just have a different drive than the Gen Xers, the baby boomers, the people before us. Another stereotype about them was that they're tech savvy. And Jason Dorsey, who's a recognized expert on millennials and done a lot of research on them, found that they weren't actually tech savvy, they were tech dependent, which is very different because with the tech dependency, they are looking for ways to actually create things to be easier for them. So they're always looking for tech that will fill something in. And it's the reason why they may not do it the way that we used to do it, because we're particularly the Gen X and the later boomers, we built the internet. We built the technology. We understand how it works. So if we wanted something, we built it. The millennials, if they want something, they figure out how they can get tech to actually help them do that. So they are more likely to be, the people who are going to use the tech. And that's what made them a little bit different than the past generations. But the stereotypes are actually found to be not, across the board, they're not what we think they are. The expectation is that they are going to be lazy or entitled or tech savvy, and they're slightly different than the expectation. And of course, if we want to have a business that runs really well with these people running now, the millennials would be our managers and our team leads and our potential C-level people. We have to make sure that they are actually getting the mentoring that they need to be able to work with both the older generation and the newer generation, which will also challenge them. So let's take a look at this newer generation. So the iGen, and I stands for internet, is the first generation that grew up completely with the opportunity to be connected to the internet. They don't know a time before the internet. So they are, I mean, the things that came out during the time that they were young, and then the opportunities for them when they started to be at an age where they could socialize, were all online. They are, the book that Jean Twang had written that came out in 2018 is called iGen, Why Today's Super Connected Kids Are Growing Up Less Rebellious, More Tolerant, Less Happy, and Completely Unprepared for Adulthood, and What That Means for the Rest of Us. So her research is really fascinating around this generation, but some of the things that she's finding are interesting for our culture and our society in general. And, you know, understanding that they mature more slowly, that they are less happy people, that they're less likely to be in trouble or do drugs or alcohol. I mean, this is a whole different generation than what our expectations are for the people who are coming into the workforce. And one of the biggest challenges for business owners that are trying to hire youth to come in and do the jobs that they want is because they're maturing more slowly. They often don't have a job, and I know this because I have 3 iGens. My kids are iGens from 17 to 21, and although they're willing to work. I know lots of business owners, many of them in Rotary, and they would volunteer for the Rotary programs that would happen, and they would be helping out other business owners, and but no one would hire them. They would apply for jobs, they'd go for interviews, and the jobs that were available to teens a generation ago were not the jobs that are necessarily available to teens today. And it's really interesting to see this this challenge for them and for the parents that are raising them, because think about it. The X generation, or Gen X, is the generation that basically parented the majority of the iGens. And the Gen X's are trying to parent these, and we grew up not knowing the internet. We had to bring it into, so we know how it works, but we didn't have to grow up that way. And we grew up with connections. We'd hang out in the corners when we were a teenager, but the iGens are not doing that anymore. In fact, they're not connecting face to face. They're more likely to connect online with the people that they connect with. And one of the experts that I was speaking to recently at a convention about culture stated that, you know, she felt that the iGens, we've got to talk about this, she said this generation is more like the same people in the same generation in different cultures than we ever have been before. And in culture, we're more like the people that we are closest to geographically. And the iGens they're closer to the people they are connected to online and not geographically, for reasons of how they interact. So the challenge for business owners is, how do you deal with that? So that's just a little bit of the background. I'm just going to run by the challenges for you, and then give you a little insight. And then because we're already about 24 minutes or so right now, and I want to make sure that I finish on time for you. So some of the challenges for business owners are around, like, how do we know who we're hiring? Like, what are the youth and adults today? What do they have? And what is it that they don't have? So if they don't have any work experience, how can we hire them? You know, so less teens get hired than they used to in the past. If they have a higher risk of depression, which is one of the findings, they're more likely to have a higher risk of depression because one of the correlative supporting issues with online social media is that everything that we see online is happy, happy me. Oh, look at them. They had the perfect life. What's wrong with me? I don't have a perfect life, right? And so we do it as adults, but if you're a teenager, you don't have that skill yet to be able to manage it. And so they're much higher risk of having depression. The ability to communicate is easier for them online than it is in person, because that's where they're spending a lot of their time, and their communications are not the same as we would have, where if you had a friend that wasn't doing really well one day, you would have a different connection with them. But if they're connecting online, everybody's happy online. So they don't have that same ability to go back and forth between what's wrong, how can I help you, with, oh, I'm so glad you're having a great day. And so some of them have less experience around traditional behaviors. I mean, I told you, we used to hang out at the corner. Our friends would all be there together. You were more likely to have tried alcohol or done drugs or something as a teenager, where they're not doing that anymore. They're less likely to read. And so, just I teach at the college, I teach Introduction to Entrepreneurship at the college as well, just the one course, but I know that a lot of my students don't even buy the textbook, even though we use the textbook explicitly, and they're told this at the beginning, and there'll be case studies that we have to go through, but they just don't buy it, and they don't necessarily read it. And it's really hard to teach them this if that's what they want. So there's some really big challenges. But one of the things I would recommend, so there's one company that's actually still doing a great job at training and maintaining a great connection with the youth that are going into their business, and that's McDonald's. McDonald's been doing this for a very, very long time. They have a great system in place, and they have, I've witnessed them take in shy, quiet, non-connection type youth and actually almost mature them into place in their positions. So, if you have an opportunity to look into what McDonald's is doing, or maybe we could coerce them into teaching us all what they're doing, what the secret sauce is to bringing this generation up, because they're doing the same thing they've been doing for years, and they still seem to have the right interaction that brings new people in. And if you've ever been to McDonald's, they're run by people who are under 30 years old, most of them under 25 or even younger. So they're definitely doing something right. So I'm happy to send you the slides on this if you would like, Howard, because I don't want to go too much longer. But if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. And if you guys are interested, anyone in your club there, any of the business owners interested, I have the Entrepreneur Awakening, making the move from business owner to entrepreneur, or making the move from employee to business owner, is the book that I wrote. And you can see it behind me here. I didn't pull up a copy, but there's a free chapter online. So if you guys want a chapter of Think Big, the big Think Big chapter, you're welcome to just go and download a copy of that. So that's Perfect. It. Thank you very much, and thanks for having me here today.
Well, thank you, especially since there weren't a lot of us. You did a very polished job. You wanted some feedback. I thought you did a really good job.
Thank you.
And it's very professional when I've had that experience where you don't have 100 people and you do the same job for the people that are there. And
Yep.
I was impressed with that. And you're a good presenter. I would make one suggestion, and it's more on a product. So I would convert your book into a video. You'll make more money with a video product than a book, and it wouldn't be hard to do.
Well, I'm not selling you anything here today, guys, so I'm just happy to, if you...
I'm just trying to help. You wanted feedback.
I appreciate
I'm not doing
that.
that for me. I'm just, because you asked me. You asked me.
Ahead of time, and you had some really great ideas, so I totally appreciate it.
That's something I would recommend. You'll find that you'll make more money if you record it and use Camtasia. Put the same slides. Put your slides on the thing. Record it with the video running on the screen, and then just burn it onto a flash drive, and you got yourself a video product.
Very cool.
Very easy to do. You could do that. You already have the material, so
I do.
So you'll make a lot more money that way. You could offer the book as a gift when they buy the video.
Thank you. That's wonderful.
Just a suggestion.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Rick, did you have something you would like to add before I close the meeting?
No, I apologize for not being online at the beginning. I had a vendor here at the house. Part of my fence got blown down. With the phone.
Oh. Okay. Well, we didn't do the invocation without you. That's your job. So I just skipped over the pledge, and it was just me. So I went right into the speaker. But I'll do the four-way test. This is what we do at the close of all our meetings. It's the four-way test, which you may be familiar with if you know Rotary. First, is it the truth? Second, is it fair to all concerned? Third, will it build goodwill and better friendships? And fourth, will it be beneficial to all concerned? And fifth, will it be fun? That's our little group one. I'll send you an app. If you're interested, you're welcome to join our group. We would love to have you. And if not, I'd still like to thank you for coming. And I will get this video online. And when I do, I'll send you a link and you can use it for your marketing if you'd like. You did a very good job. Thanks, everyone. I'll see you next week. Thanks for coming. Bye.
Everybody, bye.